Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Ground Up Show. I'm your host, Matt Diavella, and this is a podcast about starting something from nothing. This week, I'm joined by Alex Banayan, an entrepreneur and author of The Third Door, the wild quest to uncover how the world's most successful people launch their careers. On the podcast, we talk about overcoming fear, the dangers of being overly persistent, and what he's learned about finding success.
And if there's one thing that I am certain of, is that there's no, like you said, exact blueprint to success. Anyone who's trying to sell you that is, it's a get-rich-quick scheme.
This podcast is ad-free thanks to listener support. Go to patreon.com/Matt Diavella to help keep it independent and get access to exclusive videos on filmmaking and lifestyle design with new content coming every month. Again, that's patreon.com/Matt Diavella. Enjoy the show. To start things out, can you give me an introduction? Basically, what is it that you've been doing over the past 5 years? You don't have to go into crazy granular
Right.
detail because I know you've been busy. And what's your work life look like these days?
So for the past, been almost 7 years now, I've been going on a journey, tracking down some of the world's most successful people and figuring out when they were just starting, how they launched their careers. And the interviews and the stories of the journey are now in the book, The Third Door, which just came out a few months ago, and I couldn't be happier about it.
In your opinion, does success often lead to happiness? Where does that correlation look? And I imagine it's kind of difficult because a lot of the times you're interviewing these people, you're not really understanding. You can't really tell if somebody's truly happy. It's something that people kind of have to find out for themselves. But
You can get a good sense, though.
you can get it, yeah.
Like, I don't know, I've been with you for maybe like 20 minutes now, and I have a pretty fair sense that your happiness is like above average.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is that, and this is useful for anybody, it doesn't matter what you do for work. There's a big misconception that if I become successful, then I'll be happy. And across the board, whether you look at, there's a great happiness scientist named Sean Achor. He's, at Harvard and proven that wrong. Or if you just look at, anecdotal evidence from stories in the book, every single person has proven that success doesn't lead to happiness. In many ways, it's actually happiness that leads to success. And there's this great story of when I interviewed Steve Wozniak. This took place I would say about like 70% into the journey. So I'm going to interview Woz, and I fly up to Cupertino. We're having lunch at Mandarin Gourmet, 2 blocks from Apple headquarters. And we're sitting there, and this is about 15 minutes before the interview begins. I'm standing outside of the restaurant, and I get a phone call from one of my best friends. His name is Ryan. And I tell him, what's about to happen. I tell him I'm about to go interview Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple Computers. And my friend Ryan's like, "The Woz? Really?" I'm like, "Dude, what do you mean?" He's like, "Look, Woz is great, but he peaked like 20 years ago. Look at the Forbes list. Steve Jobs was at the top. Woz wasn't even on it. And, before I could respond, I asked my friend Ryan, why he had such a strong reaction. And Ryan goes, "Do you know what? Maybe it's good you're interviewing Woz. Try to find out why he wasn't as successful as Steve Jobs." And, before I could think of an answer, I look up and I see Wozniak is walking right toward me. So, I hang up with my friend. I, give Woz a big hug, and we go into this restaurant, and it's, this big sea of white tablecloths. And, we sit down at the table, and I reach for the menu, and Wozniak motions me to put it down, and he, calls over the waiter and orders for the both of us. So we have, egg rolls and honey walnut shrimp and chow mein and orange chicken. The table's overflowing. And within 10 minutes, it's undeniable that Steve Wozniak is the happiest person I've ever met. It doesn't matter if he's talking about his dogs or his cars or his wife. Everything he talks about, he has this exuberant joy. So, I become curious, and I, ask him what it was like first meeting Steve Jobs. And he told me they actually met a couple miles from where we were sitting, and they bonded not over tech, but they bonded over pranks. And I fucking love pranks. So, Woz is just telling me all these pranks, and I'm crying from laughter. And about 30 minutes later, this woman shows up at the table and sits down, And Wozniak introduces me to his wife, Janet. And Woz explains to her about the book and what I'm doing and that I'm interviewing some of the world's most successful people. And then Woz turns to me and lowers his voice and goes, I don't know why you're interviewing me. I'm not a big mogul like Steve Jobs or anything like that. And his voice trailed as if he was baiting me for a response. And I did the only thing I could think of. I stuffed an egg roll in my mouth. So I have like this big egg roll in my mouth. So Wozniak continues talking. And he goes on to explain to me that when he was young, he realized that it was so idiotic to just follow the Western society's prescription of success. And he told himself when he was young, what would I truly want to do that would make me happy? And he decided that it was two things. One, to make things with his bare hands using engineering that changes the world. And two, to have fun while doing it. So that was his two things that to him defined success. And I asked him, I'm like, is that why you're so happy? And he's like, that's exactly right. It's because I get to do what I want every day. And his wife's like, oh, he does what he wants every day. Trust me. So, the lunch continues, and my friend Ryan's question echoes back in my mind. And so I asked Woz what it was like when he was starting Apple in the early days. And he told me a bunch of stories about him and Steve Jobs. And a few stories stood out that really changed my understanding. The first story took place right before Apple got started. Steve Jobs was working at Atari, the video game company, and Woz was his best friend at the time. And Steve Jobs got assigned to make this video game, so he asked his best friend Woz, who was a much better engineer, look, I'm getting paid $750. If you make the game, I'll split you half of the $750. And Woz goes, dude, that is very generous deal. And Woz does it in 2 days, even though it was supposed to take 2 months. Jobs turns it in. The game is a home run. And Jobs gives him half of $750. It came out it came out decades later that Steve Jobs was never paid $750. He was paid thousands of dollars. So that was the first story. The second story took place right in the early days of Apple. It was very obvious Steve Jobs would be the CEO of the company, but it wasn't so obvious what Wozniak would be, where on the executive team he would fit in. So Jobs asked him, you can have any position on the executive team. What do you want? And Woz thought about it and he goes, I want my position captain engineer. Which, when you think about it, is the opposite of Silicon Valley today, right? Where the higher salary you have, the higher the position, the more successful you are. And Woz thought about it. Nothing about dealing with corporate bureaucracy and politics achieved any of the two things that to him were his definition of success. So he asked to be captain engineer. Now, the final story he told me, to me, says the most about the kind of person he is. This took place right around Apple's IPO. Jobs and Woz were set to make more money than they had ever imagined. But right before the IPO, some of the earliest Apple employees went to Wozniak and said, look, we know this is really awkward to bring up, but Steve Jobs won't give us any stock options, and we don't know what to do. And Wozniak goes, look, that must be a misunderstanding. You guys helped build the company. Let me talk to Steve. I'll get this sorted out. So Woz goes and talks to Steve Jobs, and Jobs goes, 0% chance, and slams the door. Wozniak did the only thing he could think of. He gave some of his personal shares to these early employees, because to him, they were like family. And on the day of the IPO, they all became millionaires. And, I'm sitting at this Chinese restaurant with Wozniak. He's leaning back in his chair and laughing and smiling, cracking open a fortune cookie. And again, the question my friend Ryan asked me pops into my head. And the only thing I can think is, who's to say Steve Jobs was more successful?
Is there a problem with how most of us define success? Because growing up, it seems like this version of success is kind of thrown onto us. we could blame culture, society, our family, friends. There's a lot of different influences. But at the end of the day, a lot of us see success as having the material things, having all of the stuff, the house, the cars. And I was no different. It took me being able to see an alternate path, being able to see somebody like Wozniak to be able to realize, oh, I'll do that. Right. Do you think that are the version that many of us use as our default version of success is unhealthy?
It doesn't matter if it's family or society at large. The strongest rules that have the strongest grip on us are the ones that are never explicitly said. So it's not like your parents sat you down and they're like, success is fancy cars and lots of money. Right. No one actually says that, but it's the rules that are never explicitly said that have the strongest grip on us. And nowhere in my childhood, I grew up the son of Persian Jewish immigrants, and it was communicated very clearly but implicitly that success was getting a master's degree of some point, becoming a professional, a doctor or a lawyer, and, material wealth and having a family with 3 or 4 kids and a nice big house. And that was success. And, I don't actually, when I first was going on this journey, I was very angry that I was raised with the wrong notions of success. And, I actually, with hindsight, can see that my parents, my grandparents, were just trying to help me not suffer the way they suffered. My family fled to America as refugees. This week is the 40-year anniversary of when my mom came to America. I think she was about 11 years old when she got here. And you have to understand, I'm the son of Jewish refugees. So I pretty much came out of the womb. My mom cradled me in her arms, and then she stamped MD on my ass and sent me on my way. Right. That was my childhood. I grew up, checking the boxes. I went to, pre-med summer camp. I studied for the SATs, took all the biology classes. And that in many ways informed really the origin of how this whole journey got started.
For you, when you're thinking about like success and shifting it, how have others done that on this journey? In what ways could we give advice for people who are looking to say, not make those mistakes firsthand? A lot of you know what I mean? There's something to be said.
That's the whole point of the book, to not make the mistakes firsthand.
Right. Like there's something to be said of like touching the stove, but I don't think any of us want those scars that will last a lifetime. So when you don't have mentors, when you don't have this book, sometimes you have to learn the mistakes firsthand. Sure. But I guess what advice would we give people that are just starting out on that journey, that are trying not to make the same mistakes that many others have?
Yeah, there's this great quote that I absolutely love. I believe it's a Chinese proverb that said, "One generation's hindsight can be another's foresight." And that's really at the soul of this mission, where I just believe that if all these people come together, not for press, not to promote anything, but really just to share their best wisdom with the next generation, people can do so much more. And that's sort of been like the rallying cry for me personally. And, I've learned, when I had started this book, I thought it was just for like me and my friends, Mm-hmm. That was the initial origin, but I've realized this is about a stage in life, not about an age. This is for, anybody who's trying to break through, facing rejection. How did people, when they weren't getting their phone calls answered, couldn't get a meeting, how do they find a way to break through? And to me, if we want to make it really practical, let's say someone out there right now is, whether they're just coming out of college or they're 50 years old and wanting to switch industries and they want to find that passion, here's something really practical they can do. You ready? Mm-hmm. So I call this the 30-day challenge. And this is how it works. This is for anybody who's trying to find their passion, trying to find something that, lights them up and makes them jump out of bed. So this is how it works. You go to a CVS or some pharmacy and get a, small spiral notebook and it's important to get a brand new one for like $1 and write 30-day challenge on the cover. And then for the next 30 days in a row, journal on these 3 questions. And it's super important that you do this at the same time every day for the next 30 days. So either pick the morning, pick the night, and it's not 30 days spread out over 6 months. It's 30 days consecutive. And these are the 3 questions. Number 1, what fills me with enthusiasm today? What filled me with enthusiasm today? Number 2, what drained me of energy today? What drained me of energy today? And number 3, what did I learn about myself today? Now, this might sound like super simple and basic, but what's shocking is, the first 5 days you do it, it might be fun. Every single person who I've talked to who has done it, and now there's been hundreds, if not thousands of people who have done this exercise. By day 12, it starts seeming really stupid. Like you're like, I don't understand the point of this. It's going nowhere. There's always this like little, slump. Mm-hmm. And then by day like 27, you're like, oh, I'm starting to see what the point of this was. And by day like 28 and 29 and 30, you can finally start seeing the fruit. So you sort of just have to keep pushing through it and just trust by day 29 and 30, you're going to start being able to see the patterns. Mm. And the patterns are really powerful because that's the neon sign showing you what your path is.
I love that advice because I think a lot of times all it takes is getting our thoughts down and putting it in paper and making it real, because a lot of times we don't realize what's going on behind the scenes, what we're thinking in our heads every day, all the time. And a lot of times discontent can creep up on you.
100%.
So one of the reasons why I was most excited to have you on this podcast is because I think I could get some personal advice from you. So you've had Bill Gates, Lady Gaga, Wozniak, so many people, dozens of amazing successful people that are household names. I'm trying to get my own household name on my podcast. You already saw the photo. So Dwayne The Rock Johnson is my guiding light. For the past year and a half, I've been trying to get him on the podcast. Okay. And it's been challenging. So and obviously, I know it's very hard, I think, just to pick one person and say that's the only person that I want to get on. Yeah. But I feel like in having this laser focus, it may eventually work out. There's a lot that I've done so far. I've built a website, gettherockonmattspodcast.com, lots of videos. I've gotten 2 tweets from him.
What do they say?
So a couple were just like, it was basically me posting photos of him. One, a photo of this photo on the wall, if that's not too meta. And I said, The Rock hasn't returned my phone calls yet, but I'm not giving up. And then I put a link to the website. And then he replied, I haven't returned your phone calls because you've been calling me collect, you asshole. So I'm starting to break through slowly, but the advice that I want from you, and actually I do have to, now that I've mentioned it on the podcast, I didn't have it queued up, but I held a jingle competition. Okay. So every time I mention The Rock on the podcast, I have to play the jingle. So this is
let's hear it.
So that was the winner, Sam Tier from the UK.
Nicely done, Sam.
Yeah. So as you can see, this is a journey. This is a process. Yeah. And I'm looking for advice for myself, but really I think we can also maybe 100%. Give other people advice who are looking to get that big interview, their dream interview. What steps do we take to get there?
It doesn't matter if you're trying to, get someone on your podcast or if you're trying to, meet someone who could hire you for your dream job. The steps are actually the exact same. And I'll give you something very practical, and then I'll give you, a bigger picture story. We'll start with the practical. The biggest thing that I learned, one of the people I interviewed for the book is Tim Ferriss, the author of the 4-Hour Workweek. And the way I got that interview is I hid in a bathroom. I was 18. I had to hide in a bathroom for 30 minutes, crouched behind a toilet, waiting for him to walk by and jump out. It was a big disaster. But I ended up getting the interview. And one thing that I learned about Tim Ferriss in my research is that he, in many ways, launched his career through cold emailing. He got his first job by cold emailing the CEO of a startup he wanted to work for 30 times. When he decided he didn't want to work for the startup anymore and become an author, he cold emailed the biggest best-selling authors and asked for advice. So when I was interviewing him, I was really pressing him on this cold email advice, and he finally shared with me his secret cold emailing template when he's emailing VIPs or CEOs. And it goes like this. And this goes for anybody out there. You will be shocked how well this works. But I just have to warn you, this isn't cooking where you can just, remix it to your own style. It's like baking where you have to follow it to a T. I've learned by my own mistakes that when I try to sauce it up myself, it doesn't work. You have to follow it to a T. And readers of the book, my favorite thing is going and reading the Amazon reviews, and people go in all caps, "The cold email template works!" As if it's the biggest shock to them. And to me, it makes me so happy. So this is how it goes. Ready? So let's say I'm emailing, The Rock's assistant, and his name is Jake. I would go, "Dear Jake, I know you're really busy and you get a lot of emails, so this will only take 60 seconds to read." Boom. That's the first paragraph, that one sentence. Next paragraph is 1 to 2 sentences max of who you are and what context you have that's relevant to that person. So it's not your whole bio. It's really pulling out the 1 to 2 sentences in your bio that's relevant to the person. Boom. Next paragraph, 1 to 2 sentences max, again, of your hyper specific question for that person. The fastest way to get your email, and I'm sure you know this, your email archived or deleted, is saying, "I would love to grab coffee." With a stranger, it just doesn't really work.
Pick your brain.
Right. I love to pick your brain. I'd love your advice on something. If you can give me a call, If you give us hyper specific question, only then will someone open up and want to start a conversation, right? So that's that paragraph. And the final paragraph is the clincher. You go, "I totally understand if you're too busy to respond. Even a 1 or 2 line reply will completely make my day. All the best, Tim." And it's been shocking that I've gotten interviews for the book using the cold email template. I've met mentors that have changed my life, and readers of the book have, reached out to Sheryl Sandberg and Malcolm Gladwell, and it's really been remarkable. So that's a really specific thing.
I think, sorry, not to cut you off, but I think what's also great about it is that you're also likely somebody will read that email, and it very likely might be the person that you're trying to get to. And just because they're going to say no this time doesn't mean that a year down the road they might change their mind. So if you email them in a way that's unprofessional or is distasteful, and it doesn't take very long for somebody to be like, to see that person again in their inbox. They may remember that person, or maybe they just do a search in their inbox and see that you wrote this 100%. Shitty email 3 years ago or 2 years ago. I think it's just being respectful with that person and being the kind of person that understands that person's situation.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Now, a bigger picture lesson actually comes straight from Steven Spielberg. So what most people don't know is that Spielberg launched his career when he was right about 19 years old. He got rejected from film school not once, but twice. So most people normally, when they're rejected from film school twice, might think, maybe this isn't meant for me. But he decided to take his education into his own hands. He went to a community college right here in LA, and he ditched class, went to Universal Studios theme park, went on the tram ride, rode around the lot, jumped off the tram, hid in a bathroom, waited for the tram to drive away, and he started walking around the lot. So, he's wandering on this lot, and he bumps into an older man who asks him, "What are you doing here?" And Spielberg tells him the truth. He's 19 years old. His biggest dream is to be a director, and he jumped off the tram to walk around. And the older man, his name was Chuck Silvers, and he was the head of the Universal Television Library. And Chuck Silvers and Spielberg end up talking for an hour. And at the end of the hour, Chuck Silvers goes, "How would you like to come back onto the lot?" And Spielberg goes, "That would be a dream." So Chuck Silvers writes a 3-day pass. Spielberg comes back the first day and the second day and the third day. And then on the fourth day, he shows back up, in a suit carrying his dad's briefcase, walks right up to the security gate, waves to the guard and goes, "Hey, Scotty!" And the guard just waves back and Spielberg walks right in. And, he's doing this for months. He's sneaking on editing bays, he's sneaking onto sound stages, and he's soaking up all the information he can. He's asking directors and actors out to lunch. And after months of doing this, Chuck Silver slowly becomes Spielberg's mentor, and he gave him some great advice. Chuck Silver sat him down and said, "Look, there comes a time in your life you're going to have to stop schmoozing and go make something of value to show people." And Spielberg took that advice to heart and decided to go spend months directing and editing a short film called Amblin. And he comes back to Chuck Silver's and shows him this short film. And it was so good that a single teardrop came down his face. And Chuck Silver's reached for the phone and called the vice president of production of Universal Television, Sid Sheinberg. And he goes, "Sid, I got something you got to see." And Sid Sheinberg's like, "Look, there's a lot of things people say I have to see. Like, this. Mm-hmm. You work in the world, right?" And Chuck Silver goes, "No, it's that important. If you don't watch this, somebody else will." And Sid Sheinberg goes, "You think it's that goddamn important?" And Silver's like, "Yes, it's that goddamn important." And sure enough, that night, the VP watched it, and the next morning called Spielberg, told him to come to his office, and on the table was a contract making him the youngest director in Hollywood history. Now, when you zoom out on that story, some people might just say, Spielberg played the people game. He networked around the lot, and to me, that really doesn't do justice to what happened there. I sort of see it as the Spielberg game, Step 1, jump off the tram. Step 2, find your inside man. Step 3, use that inside man as your way in. And the key to that, to me, is really that inside man. If it wasn't for Chuck Silver's, 1, writing Spielberg the 3-day pass, 2, giving him that insight into how the system works, and 3, putting his reputation on the line when he called the vice president of production, none of this would have happened. And of course, Spielberg was undeniably talented, but so are a lot of young directors out there. The difference to me is that inside man. And when I think of your story with The Rock, I think the thing that's missing right now, clearly you have the website, you already have some touch points, but it's finding that inside man, someone in The Rock's inner circle of, 5 people that The Rock really listens to. And having that person say, "Trust me, that if you're going to do one podcast this year, it's this one."
And I think the hardest thing is, how do you approach those kinds of relationships? Because my greatest fear would be that somebody would think that I'm just using them to get somebody else. Yeah. So how do you approach somebody that's in the inner circle? Yeah. I imagine you have to straight up come out with your intentions.
You got to be, you have to be
because Spielberg specifically, it wasn't, at least in that scenario, I imagine he didn't see the end goal of, I'm going to make a film, and then it was just built the relationship first, and then the inside man helped bring him inside. If you have a specific scenario where you're trying to get an interview, how do you approach that relationship?
Well, I think with Spielberg and with this, it's actually very similar, where you're very honest about your intention. An important part of the Spielberg story was when Chuck Silver stopped him on the lot and said, "What are you doing here?" Spielberg said the truth. "I'm 19. I jumped off this tram, and my biggest dream is to be a director." And Chuck Silver goes, "Got it. I got you." And
right, so he wasn't at that point. He wasn't pretending to be
right.
This
he wasn't like, "Oh, I just got lost. Do you mind if I shadow you a little?" No, Spielberg said the truth. I sort of broke the rules. I wandered around because this is my biggest dream. And, let's say you find the person who might be in The Rock's inner circle, and you have a friend who might introduce you to that person. The introduction has to be really clear, which is, your biggest dream is to interview The Rock. You know how hard that is and how rare that is. And you would still love to meet this person either way and get to know them. Mm-hmm. And that way the relationship is still organic, but the person knows that it's not that you have an ulterior motive. You actually have a really profound and authentic intention.
Would you suggest that most people, say if they have a podcast or they're trying to interview people or find a new job, is to not pick one person that you want. And I know obviously this is like a rare, weird exception, and there are many of those exceptions out there. But for most people who are just trying to have a successful blog and they want to interview people for it, would it be best to not be so specific and to say, you know what, like I've got a list. I've got these 20 people that I would really want to interview. Because I imagine for as many amazing people that you interviewed, there were a lot that said no.
Okay, do you want the technically correct answer or the emotionally correct answer?
You can give both.
Okay. The technically correct answer to that question, it's a really important question, is that you always need a pipeline. Because what's going to happen if you're trying to reach out to anybody, whether you're trying to reach out to someone you want to interview or whether you're trying to reach out to, someone you want to get a job from, you're going to get bullshit no's. You're going to, let's say email a CEO of a startup that you want to work for, and the person's going to be like, oh, we're not hiring. And then you're going to see next week they hired someone. Mm-hmm. It's just a bullshit no, because people are human beings and they're afraid of confrontation. They don't like to say the truth. It's just a very sad part of human behavior. But if you have 30 people in your pipeline, it doesn't matter if you get a bullshit no from one person, because you now have 29 other people you can still work on. And then you don't have to harass that one person that gave you a bullshit no, even though that might be what you want to do and just bang on the door 100 times. You can work on everyone else and then maybe a year later go back to them and that door is still open.
So not to throw you off your train of thought, but how often can you pound on somebody's door? Because I think that's one really difficult thing is that you get... And I get like maybe 8-10 emails from the same influencer networks that are trying to sign me as a partner. And I'm like, I don't even say no just because I get them so often. Right. But the repetition's not going to help. And it's not going to work.
Dude, I learned this lesson the hard way. When I was trying to interview Tim Ferriss, in addition to crouching in the bathroom, I also emailed his assistant 32 times. It didn't make Tim very happy. And sadly, I was so young, I couldn't learn my lesson at that point because I made the same mistake again with Warren Buffett. Now, this is one of the biggest mistakes I made on this whole 7-year journey. Warren Buffett was the person who I sort of set my eyes on, and I thought, look, if anyone's going to say yes to an interview, it had to be Warren Buffett. He loves college students. He loves helping young people, so I made that my number one thing. He was my rock, And for the next 8 months, I didn't work on anyone else but Warren Buffett, and that was the biggest mistake of my life. I would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, put on my running shoes, put on the Rocky theme song in my earbuds, and I would sprint down the sidewalk pretending Warren Buffett was at the end. I was that deranged trying to get to him, right? I would wake up, read Warren Buffett biographies. I would draft letters to him, and every week I would send him a new letter. And every Wednesday, I would call his assistant. And, after 3 months of being rejected, it really hurts. By month 6, you're coughing up blood. And, I'm 20 years old at the time, too. So my sense of identity is completely attached to this project and this mission. And by month 8, I'm completely dejected. And what ended up happening is I actually ended up hacking Warren Buffett's shareholders meeting, which is a whole story in and of itself. But the important part is that after that, I actually finally got the interview with Bill Gates completely separately. And the interview with Bill Gates went so well that at the end, Gates' office said, let us know how we can help. And I'm like, well, I can use some help with Warren Buffett. And they're like, oh, that's an easy one. Wow. Bill and Warren are best friends. So I get an email from Bill Gates' office a couple weeks later saying, please no more messages to Warren's office. Thanks. And I'll never know exactly what happened, but I assume it went something like, oh, we know all about Alex. This is not happening. I've been calling their office every week for 8 months. And what that taught me is that not only was the answer still no from Buffett's office, I had pounded on the door so many times I got myself blacklisted. And every business book talks about the value of persistence, but no business book warns you about the dangers of over persistence. where you can pound on a door so many times that instead of knocking it down, they call the police on you. And I had dug myself into such a deep hole that even Bill Gates couldn't pull me out. And no one talks about that.
That's crazy.
Look, not the most fun part of this journey.
But yeah, one of those hot stove memories that for sure, where
right.
you learned it the hard way.
Right.
And it's unfortunate that, I mean, who knows? Time
right.
can always turn things around.
I hope so, man.
Yeah.
I hope so.
So did you have I know I kind of sidetracked you a little bit, but was that the emotional response you were talking about?
Well, in a big way, the technical response, is have the pipeline. That's the answer.
Yeah.
You definitely need to have a pipeline. It doesn't matter what you're working on. Now, emotionally, and this is where I differ with a lot of other people, I actually think it's amazing that you have The Rock as your holy grail interview. Because to me, in many ways, Bill Gates, I talked about Buffett, but in many ways, Bill Gates is my ultimate mountaintop interview. And in hindsight, I can see that if I didn't have that, so many good things happen on my way to get to Bill Gates. And so many disastrous things happen that taught me incredible lessons. And if it wasn't for that holy grail of trying to reach Bill Gates, none of those other things would happen. So I think you actually having this laser focus on The Rock is going to take you on a really cool journey that's going to take you exactly where you need to be. And whether that's sitting with The Rock or not, it actually isn't the point.
What was that like for you?
But you'll sit with The Rock.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of, you talk about Wozniak's definition of success. And for me, I wouldn't put getting The Rock on my podcast as in my version of success, because I don't think that you should really hinge your success or happiness on things that you can't control. Right. That said, it is the biggest and craziest goal that I have. And I think it's fun. I think we all should have fun, crazy goals that we chase after.
And that are possible.
Yeah.
It's not 100% that far-fetched. He lives right here in LA.
Yeah.
He does interviews all the time for movies. It's not far-fetched.
Yeah. So when you
just haven't given him an offer that he can't refuse yet.
I know. Well, that's the third. Yeah. Who knows if you actually could? Because somebody like, so I'm actually curious about you approaching that Bill Gates interview. Like, this is your Rock moment. How nervous are you? How do you prepare for an interview that's that big that you maybe don't get a second chance to?
Oh, yeah.
You almost certainly will not get a second chance to.
Right. So I have a method with my interviews where I really like. I spend, at the bare minimum, weeks, but normally months, reading everything I can about the person. Now, these are the big interviews for the book. I've adapted it over the years, but for the big Bill Gates-like interviews, I'll read everything I can, because if you're sitting down with a person of that caliber who's done thousands of interviews in their life, you don't want to waste their time. And you want to make sure the questions you're asking are questions that you're not easily just going to read about in his biography. In many ways, you almost want to write down the questions you have for him originally, read all of his biographies, watch all of his interviews over the course of multiple months, and then write the follow-up questions. So by the time you sit down with him, it's almost as if it's your 8th interview with him. Because you're using all the information out there already to answer your first 7 rounds of questions. And that's what makes for a great interview.
Right. I guess if you already have the answers to the questions, why ask them to begin with?
Right. If you're asking, now there's a rare exception of sometimes I like to ask a question or two in the beginning to set the mood.
Yeah.
But that's only if you have that luxury.
Yeah. And I think even like what we were talking about before the podcast is a lot of people focus a little bit too much on getting information out of somebody versus actually having an enjoyable conversation. And, I think we have to sometimes let go of the expectations that every interview you have is going to be this life-changing, transformative experience for your audience or for yourself. And it's just enjoy yourself. Let go and actually have a conversation with somebody.
I agree 100%. One of the people I interviewed for the book was Larry King. Undeniably one of the greatest interviewers in history. And Larry King gave me his, biggest interview advice. And he said, the biggest mistake young interviewers make is they look at the interviewers they admire, whether it's Oprah or Barbara Walters or Larry King, and they try to copy their styles. And he said, that's the biggest mistake you can make, because you're not asking yourself why we have those styles. And, Oprah has all this emotion, and Barbara Walters has all these strategic questions, and Larry likes to ask, the simple, direct questions. And Larry said, you're not understanding why we have those styles. The reason we have those styles is because that's what makes us the most comfortable in our seats. And when we're comfortable, the guest is comfortable. And that's what makes for the best interview.
Mm. So how did the Bill Gates one roll out? Were you your most comfortable?
No, of course not. I had to touch the stove myself.
Yeah.
I had to touch the stove myself. What happened, though, is that at the end of the Bill Gates interview, and I got tremendous lessons out of it. I learned his negotiating secrets, his sales secrets. But it wasn't until the very end of the interview where, Bill Gates' chief of staff's like, you have 1 minute left. And I'm like, oh, fuck. I look at my notepad and there's still like all these unasked questions. And I asked myself, if you have 1 minute with Bill Gates, just have some fun with it. And I threw my question to the side and I just looked at him and I was like, and I still remember, if I close my eyes, I can remember, sitting, it was this, ivory gray couch, and I'm sitting on the right end of the couch. Bill is on a armchair to my right. I'm 20 at the time. This is like one of the biggest life moments for me. And I had spent 2 years trying to get to this point. And I look at him and I'm just like, what was one of the most funny hustle stories from early on? And Gates just, sits back in his chair and his eyes lift up and he starts to smile. And it looks as if he's like watching a movie in his mind's eye. And he starts laughing just to himself. And he starts telling me this hilarious story when he was just starting out and traveling in Japan, selling Microsoft software in Japan. And I'm now cracking up. The chief of staff is cracking up. And it's as if all the tension of the past hour had shattered. And this was no longer an interview. It was just a couple people having a good time. And Bill now started telling me all these other stories that I didn't even know to ask about. And I could feel this warmth spreading throughout the room. And, the interview wrapped up and we shook hands and he said goodbye. And I remember looking over my shoulder, like getting this one final glimpse and wishing I had started the interview like that to begin with.
What a lesson.
Yeah.
So for a lot of people that listen to this podcast, I try to help people who are just getting started out on their journey. So when you're at the very beginning, you have an idea of how you're going to be able to make it. We love to give advice. I got it in college to create a business plan, 5-year business plan, and follow these certain steps to get there. And from what you've learned, this idea of the third door, there aren't just two options for making it. I love it if you just talked a little bit about what the conclusion you came to after interviewing all these people.
When I had started the journey, I was 18 years old, a freshman in college, and there was no part of me that was searching for that, one key to success, because I've seen all the TED Talks. I read all those business books, and anyone who talked about the one key to success, I would normally just roll my eyes, and I'm sure you've seen all those videos. And when I had set off on the journey, what happened, though, is over these 7 years, I don't know if you're a big music fan, but it was almost like there was a common melody in every single interview I did. And it doesn't matter if it was Maya Angelou for poetry or Jane Goodall for science or, Quincy Jones. Every single person who I interviewed treated life and business and success the exact same way. And the analogy that came to me, because I was 21 at the time, was that, it's sort of like getting into a nightclub. There's always 3 ways in. There's the first door, the main entrance, where the line curves around the block. where 99% of people wait around hoping to get in. That's the first door. You're just standing in line, holding your resume, hoping the bouncer lets you through. That's the first door. And then there's the second door, the VIP entrance, where billionaires and celebrities go through. And for some reason, school and society have this way of making us feel like those are the only two ways in. You either wait your turn or you're born into it. But what I've learned is that there's always the third door. And it's the entrance where you jump out of line and run down the alley, bang on the door 100 times, crack open the window, go through the kitchen. There's always a way in. And it doesn't matter if that's how Bill Gates sold his first piece of software or how Lady Gaga got her first record deal. They all took the third door. So that's not only, the title of the book and the thesis of the book, that's really the energy that I'm trying to inject into the readers.
And I imagine this third door, it's never going to be the same. There's no template. There's no recipe to follow. Each person, depending on their platform, their career, whatever it is they're doing, that's the hard part because they're going to have to figure it out for themselves.
100%. I had spent 7 years spending thousands of hours researching, going through hundreds of biographies and sitting down with, dozens and dozens of people who I was dying to get answers from. And if there's one thing that I am certain of is that there's no, like you said, exact blueprint to success. Anyone who's trying to sell you that is, it's a get rich quick scheme. But there is undeniably a mindset. And the third door is a mindset. It's a way of viewing your problems. And when you have that third door mindset, really what it gives you is a sense of possibility that there's always a way. And it doesn't matter if it's cracking open the window, going through the kitchen, there's always a way.
Something that I'd love to ask you, something that I've been talking about more and more on the podcast and outside of it, is this idea of our hustle culture and how we really value and admire the hustle, the grind, the work ethic. But sometimes it can come at a detriment. Sometimes we can push ourselves a little bit too far. And I imagine most successful people in the world, that's something that they have all experienced in finding that line of going a little bit too far. How do you think that we can hustle or work hard with more intention?
This is something I've thought a lot about. Something really important to me. My understanding of all that changed about 1.5 years ago when my dad passed away. He passed away from pancreatic cancer, and he actually passed away about 2 miles from where we are right now. And I'll never forget what it was like being in that room and seeing him take his final breath. It's something you never forget. And I hate when people talk about, the silver lining of a parent passing away, because I really don't believe there's ever a silver lining. But naturally you do learn things, and something that I have learned from my dad passing away, and it's not just the day he passed away. It was really because he had pancreatic cancer. It was this 14th month dying process. And after he passed, it sort of showed me that, it doesn't matter how hard you worked or how little you worked. At the end of the day, we all die, and we all die in many ways the same way. And, you talk about this, this hustle culture. I think there's this, and we talked about in the beginning, this the implicit messages in our society. I think there's this implicit message that if you outgrind someone else, if you put in more hours, there's a special award on your deathbed. And it sounds funny, but I remember literally the week after my dad passed, realizing, my dad, I love my dad, but he didn't really have a job. He sort of worked with my mom, and I think a lot of who I am, and I'm doing a lot of reflecting on it, is a reflection of who he was. And again, there's no reward for working hard on your deathbed. There's no punishment for not working hard enough on your deathbed. At the end, we're all humans and we die the same way. And I think many times people who are out trying to outgrind and out hustle comes from this original fear. And Thich Nhat Hanh, the really famous Zen monk, talks about original fear being, when you're born. And whether you believe in this or not, the idea is really interesting. When you're born, the second you come out of the womb is the first time you ever experience fear. And it's the fear of death. The second you're born, you have the initial burst of fear of death because you were in this womb where everything was taken care of for you. You had this umbilical cord, you had the embryonic sac, you were in many ways heaven, right? Everything was taken care of. And all of a sudden you come into this room with bright lights, you have to start breathing, there's liquid in your throat, you're choking. You come into this world choking and about to die. If you actually think about it, it's pretty interesting. I've never thought of that. You come into the world trying not to die. Mm-hmm. And that's original fear. Trying not to die. And I think in many ways that follows most people their entire life. And it wasn't until my dad passed away where I sort of got to realize for myself that I got to face my own original fear, my own fear of death. And I realized I'm going to die anyways. And I might as well live the way I want. Because there's no amount of hard work I can do that's going to prevent me from dying. And there's no amount of slacking off that will make me die faster. So I might as well do it the way I like.
I imagine there are things in our lives that we have to define as things not worth sacrificing. There's certain things where we have to draw the line.
Yeah.
And sometimes our life gets out of balance. Sometimes we have busy periods. Like you said, you were just in Ohio this morning. Like sometimes we have to push ourselves a little bit hard when we're promoting a book and we're on tour and we're doing all these things. But you need to take a step back and look over the course of the year and say, did I sacrifice things that were too important to me? Did I sacrifice on my values and my principles?
Right. There's this anecdote, it's a super famous anecdote. I'm sure you probably heard it before, of this, college professor that has, these buckets of rocks, pebbles, and sand. And, he has this big jar and he's trying to teach the class about life priorities. And he said, the sand and the pebbles and the rocks are symbols for the things in your life. The rocks are the big things in your life, your family, your life mission, your health. The pebbles are the things that are a little less important. The sand is like, social media and, what people think of you and your clothing, whatever, right? And he said, let's see how many things we can put into this one jar. And first he puts the sand and fills it all the way to the top. And he's like, do we have rooms for pebbles or rocks? And everyone's like, no, the jar is already full. So he empties it out again and he starts again. He's like, all right, now let's start if we first put in the big things. So he puts in the rocks and now the rocks go all the way to the top. And then he pours in the pebbles and the pebbles fill in the space. And then he pours in the sand and the sand fills up all the space. And the lesson is really clear, which is that if you fill your day with the things that matter to you most, whether it's your family, your health, your work, all the other things will fill in the space in between. But if you're spending, I have a lot of friends who spend so much of their time on, trying to optimize their Instagram page and they're not calling back their best friends. And, everyone's on their own path and I don't think anyone's doing it right or wrong. I've just learned for myself, and especially again after my dad passed, that we're going to die. My dad died when he was 60. And something I took away from it is my dad lives 60 years. To a lot of people that's young, but also 60 years is 60 years. But I could see in my dad's eyes how much he felt that he was getting shortchanged. And I realized it doesn't matter if you're living for 60 years. My grandpa's 93 right now, and he still feels like he's dying too early. So it doesn't matter how long you lived. You're always going to feel like there wasn't enough time. So you might as well use that time for the things that you care about most.
I imagine you want to end your life knowing that you don't have any regrets either. Yeah. And I think typically the things that people end up regretting are those things that they didn't do, the businesses they didn't try to start. Yeah. And there is that fear, like you said, that basic fear that we have from the moment we're born, that we're going to fail, that everything's going to fall apart, we're not going to be able to make it. And what does it take to get over those hurdles, to get over that initial fear, to create the things we want, including creating a life that we want?
There's anyone who's out there who's struggling with dealing with fear, dealing with insecurities, dealing with, life sort of falling apart in many ways. There's one book I recommend above all else.
The Third Door.
That as well, but it's a book called When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron. And I first started reading the book when my dad got diagnosed with cancer. And if there's ever been a book that's completely changed my outlook on life for the better, it's that book. If anyone out there is like super nerdy like me, it was sort of like the software update I needed and I didn't even know I needed. And this book helped me realize that fear is a natural part of the human existence. And when you try to fight your fear, that's when it has the strongest grip over your life. But when you accept your fear and invite it in to, your mental living room, allow it to sit down on the couch, maybe you offer it some cookies, the fear sort of relaxes. It's still there. Don't get me wrong. It doesn't magically disappear, but it stops arguing with you and it just sort of sits around, and, happiness sits next to it, and then joy makes it laugh a little. And after a while, you'll notice the fear sort of quiets down and might just slip out the back door. But that only works when you first give it permission to stay. When you fight your fear, it grows. When you give it permission, it releases.
Yeah, there's I imagine a lot of times fear can be a guiding post for us. It's a way to realize that we're actually pushing ourselves into territory that's worth pursuing. Because if everything was easy, if success was easy, then everybody would do it, and we wouldn't even be having this podcast.
100%.
But the more you push yourself into those uncomfortable situations, that fear, the more that it will drop away, and the more that you'll find new things to be afraid of. I think that's probably something that we should be trying to push ourselves to do every day. If you're not feeling fear, then you're probably not pursuing a meaningful life.
One of the biggest, I couldn't agree more. And one of the biggest lessons I've learned on this whole journey is really surrounding fear. Because when I had started out, I was completely consumed by fear. Something most people don't know about me is when I was young, I was like the most scared kid you would ever meet. I had a nightlight until I was like 12 years old, And I'm serious. I would go to theme parks with my friends and it would be miserable for them because me debating whether I'm going to go on a roller coaster or not was the most annoying debate in history. And when I started working on the book when I was 18, I was completely consumed by fear. So naturally, one of my biggest questions was, how did all these other people who achieved these monumental things relate to their fear? I just assumed Bill Gates or Elon Musk had to be fearless, or else how would they have done what they did? When I started doing my research and I started doing my interviews, over and over and over again, I started to get the same answer, which was the last thing I expected. Not only were these people scared, they were completely terrified the whole way through. So it wasn't fearlessness they achieved. It was courage. And while it sounds similar, the difference is critical. And if there's one thing, I want to sort of like implant into people's heads, it's this small difference because it can change your life. Fearlessness is jumping off of a cliff and not thinking about it. That's idiotic. Courage, on the other hand, is acknowledging your fears, analyzing the consequences, and then deciding you care so much about it, you're still going to take one thoughtful step forward anyway.
I love it. You want to wrap up with a couple quick questions?
Yes.
Quick questions, not quick answers unless you want them to be quick.
Okay.
It's totally up to you. But it's not it's not rapid fire, it's quick questions.
Great. I love it.
So if you could go back to a version of yourself, I know that you dropped out of college. But for those that are around that time where maybe they're thinking about dropping out or they're about to graduate college, what advice would you give them if they're setting out to pursue something unconventional? Or I guess also I think another way to phrase it would be like, what would you do differently?
The biggest thing, whether you're doing something unconventional or you're contemplating doing something unconventional, would be, and if I can go back in time and talk to myself, my 18, 19-year-old self, I would remind myself that just because things aren't working out now, just because you're consumed by fear or you're facing rejection, it doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. And I think there's this big misconception that if it doesn't work out right away, there's something wrong with the project. And it's, it's the most idiotic idea, but it's so prevalent. And it was a big thing I was debating constantly in my journey. And if I can go back in time, I would remind myself, it's natural for things not to work out automatically in the beginning. Bill Gates, what no one knows, but, if you open his biography, it's right there. He dropped out of Harvard, took a semester off to start working on Microsoft. But then Microsoft didn't take off the way he had hoped, so he went back to college, did another semester of school, and then was like, all right, let me try one more time. And he took another semester off, worked on Microsoft, and then it started to go. It never blasts off the way you think. Mark Zuckerberg, in the summer when he was working on Facebook the whole time, full time, when he had 250,000 users, he pulled Sean Parker aside, his mentor, and said, is this thing a fad? It's never clear when you're in the trenches. It's only clear in hindsight. And the only person who can decide whether you're going to move forward or stop is you.
I'm curious. Obviously, you've read tons of biographies in researching for this book, but it sounds like it's something that you're really into anyway. Were there 2 or 3 recommendations that you'd give for people who are interested in learning about some of these individuals? Which were the most captivating for you that you picked up and you couldn't put down?
That's a great question. Biography specifically is important.
Yeah. Because
normally I give other kinds of book recommendations.
Yeah, and I haven't read a biography in a while, so this is a selfish question. I've definitely read. There are some that just kind of really pull you in, and it's always fascinating to learn about these people's lives.
The Steve Jobs biography is great it's just fascinating, period. Mm-hmm. You'll learn the lessons that everyone who I've talked to who's read the Steve Jobs biography has taken away different lessons. The lessons I took away, other people took away different lessons. It's just fascinating because it's written really well.
Yeah.
And it's just covers one of the most interesting lives out there. So the Steve Jobs biography, I highly recommend, by Walter Isaacson. Anyone who's even remotely interested in finance, even if you don't want to go into finance and you just want to understand how someone goes from, middle class to the second richest person in the United States, should read The Snowball, which is the biography of Warren Buffett. There's multiple biographies on Buffett. I've read way too many of them. The Snowball is the one that covers his life the best. And a third would be I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. Now, what people need to understand before reading it, I'm sure many people have already read it, it's her autobiography, but of her early years, of when she's, I believe, from 5 years old to 10 years older. It covers the very beginning of her life. Her whole autobiography is a multi-part series of books. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, though, is powerful because it covers a time in her life when she was raped at 8 years old, and it gives an insight into what it was like being black in America at that time, being an 8-year-old survivor of rape. And it's written, though, from a 40-year-old's perspective. Many times we read biographies or autobiographies where it's, Richard Branson looking back on his whole life in his, 70s or whatnot. I think there's something really powerful about someone in their, 40s looking back at when they're 8 and having a whole book just on that topic. And it's, gorgeously written, of course.
What's one universal skill that you think all creators should learn or haven't put enough time into?
Oh my God. I am so surprised by the first thing that came to my mind, and I'm just going to go with it, which is meditation. And the reason I'm surprised by it is because skill, I was expecting my answer to be, whether it's storytelling or... The reason I think meditation was the first thing that came to my mind is that meditation creates the space for whatever your natural talents and skills are to flourish.
Is that something that you saw with a lot of the people that you interviewed?
A lot of the people that I interviewed, to the point where I would say maybe 3 or 4 years into my journey, I
started meditating?
I come from an immigrant family. So meditation and therapy are equivalent to cocaine to my parents, it's like these taboos. It's like, oh God, he went to a therapist. He must be a drug addict,
right.
So to me, I'm studying all these successful people. I'm talking with all the people who work with them. And I just start noticing the ones that are happiest and the ones that are most relaxed all do this weird thing called meditating. And to me, I had no interest in meditating at all. But I don't know, if I was interviewing all the world's most successful people and they all told me they took this pill called, XYZ, I'd be like, I'll take it for a week. Let's see what happens. I don't know. If they all said they all do, Molly for breakfast, I'd be like, I'll try it for a week. I don't know if it works for Buffett and Oprah.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens. And
for the record, they did not do Molly.
For the record, they did not do Molly. But after a while, Oprah Winfrey, Jerry Seinfeld, Ellen DeGeneres, Ray Dalio, they all are talking about this thing called, meditation, transcendental meditation specifically. So I'm just like, what's the worst that can happen? I take a class and I think it's stupid. That's the worst case scenario. It transformed my life better than anything. And I think what's actually sort of interesting is I didn't start meditating for spiritual reasons at all. I did it as almost a business experiment where all these people who do really well in business swear by this thing. Let me see what would happen. And I literally did it as, in my mind, a business expense. Paying whatever the cost was for the meditation class to me was a business expense to just test out one of the things in the book. And literally I put meditation up there with learning how to eat healthy and learning how to read. It's in that caliber of life-changing things.
Start meditating. Thank you so much for this book. I cannot wait to read it. If people want the book, if people want to see more from you, where should we send them?
The book is available. First of all, thank you. The book is available everywhere people like to buy books. So whether it's Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Kindle or Audible, I read the audiobook myself. So it was a lot of fun. And if you end up getting the book from the podcast, let me know on social so I can say a big thank you.
Awesome.
And dude, thank you, man.
Yeah, thank you so much, dude. This was a lot of fun.
This was amazing.
That's it for this week's episode of The Ground Up Show. Thank you so much for watching and listening. This podcast is 100% ad-free and is brought to you by Patreon subscribers. If you want to get access to exclusive videos on filmmaking, podcasting, and much more, go to patreon.com/Matt Diavella. Every contribution will also help to keep this podcast ad-free, which is pretty damn awesome. I appreciate your support, and I'll see you next time.